The small things caught Mrs. Lee's attention first. A faint bruise on her grandmother's arm that hadn't been there the day before. The way her usually cheerful grandmother would grow quiet when certain staff members entered her room at Golden Sunset Care Home. But most troubling was how her bright-eyed, sweet-natured grandmother, who had raised 3 children on her own and never complained about a thing, now seemed afraid to be left alone. "Everything okay, Nai-Nai?" Mrs. Lee would ask during her daily visits, watching her grandmother's hands fidget with the blanket on her lap. "Oh yes, yes. Just clumsy these days," her grandmother would reply with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Old bones, you know how it is." But Mrs. Lee knew her grandmother wasn't clumsy. In fact, before moving to Golden Sunset 6 months ago, she had been remarkably steady for her age. The so-called falls from her wheelchair started only after she moved into the facility. The first incident happened on a Tuesday evening. The night supervisor called around 9 p.m., explaining that Mrs. Lee's grandmother had somehow slipped from her wheelchair while being transferred to bed. Just an accident, they said. These things happen with elderly residents. Mrs. Lee rushed to the facility that night, finding her grandmother with a nasty bruise on her hip and tears in her eyes. The staff had an explanation ready. Sometimes elderly residents get confused, they said. Sometimes they try to get up on their own. But her grandmother had always been sharp as a tack, and she knew better than to try standing without help. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time, they said she had rolled too close to the doorway and tipped over. The bruises were worse, and now there was a small cut on her forehead. Mrs. Lee's grandmother became more withdrawn, jumping at sudden noises and keeping her eyes fixed on the door whenever she was alone in her room. The third fall came barely a month later. Mrs. Lee arrived for her morning visit to find her grandmother in bed, refusing breakfast. The night staff claimed they had found her on the floor at 3 a.m., wheelchair overturned beside her. They wrote it off as another unfortunate accident, but the fear in her grandmother's eyes told a different story. During her next visit, Mrs. Lee overheard 2 other families in the hallway discussing similar accidents with their loved ones. One elderly man had mysterious bruises appearing on his arms. Another resident suddenly became terrified of nighttime care. Mrs. Lee started keeping a diary, documenting every unexplained mark, every fearful reaction, every accident report. She noticed patterns. The incidents seemed to happen more frequently during certain shifts, with certain staff members. Her grandmother's behavior would change dramatically when specific aides were working, though she refused to say why. The final straw came when Mrs. Lee arrived early one morning, finding her grandmother silently crying in her wheelchair, facing the window. A fresh bruise marked her cheek, but the staff insisted they had no incident reports from the previous night. Something was terribly wrong at Golden Sunset, and her grandmother couldn't, or wouldn't, tell her what it was. Driving home that evening, Mrs. Lee's hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Her grandmother had been there for her entire life, baking her favorite cookies after school, teaching her to sew, holding her through her first heartbreak. Now it was her turn to protect her grandmother, but how? The facility always had explanations ready, and without proof, it would be her word against theirs. That's when an idea began to form. If she couldn't get answers from the staff or her frightened grandmother, perhaps she needed to find another way to uncover the truth. She pulled into her driveway, picked up her phone, and called her brother. They needed to talk about hidden cameras. The more Mrs. Lee looked into the situation at Golden Sunset Care Home, the more troubling patterns she discovered. It started with simple conversations in the facility's waiting room, just casual chats with other families who came to visit their loved ones. At first, people were hesitant to share, but once Mrs. Lee mentioned her grandmother's mysterious falls, the stories began pouring out. "My mother keeps telling me her jewelry goes missing," whispered one woman, clutching her coffee cup. "The staff says she's just misplacing things, but she's been wearing the same rings for 40 years. she'd never just lose them. An elderly man, visiting his wife, overheard them talking. "It's not just the missing items," he said, lowering his voice. "My wife used to love having her hair done every Friday. Now she refuses to let certain staff members even brush it. She won't tell me why." Mrs. Lee started keeping detailed notes on her phone. Each conversation revealed another piece of a disturbing puzzle. She noticed how some residents would grow quiet when particular staff members walked by, how call buttons would go unanswered during certain shifts, how medication times seemed to vary widely, despite the strict schedule the facility claimed to follow. One afternoon, while helping her grandmother arrange flowers in her room, Mrs. Lee noticed something odd. The wheelchair's safety brake, which should have been regularly checked by staff, was loose. When she mentioned this to the floor supervisor, the response was dismissive. "Oh, these old chairs, always something wrong with them. We'll get maintenance to look at it, eventually." That same day, Mrs. Lee met Mr. Chen, whose father lived down the hall. He shared how his dad, once social and outgoing, now refused to attend any evening activities. "He keeps saying he doesn't feel safe after dinner," Mr. Chen explained, worry lines creasing his forehead. "But when I ask why, he just shakes his head and looks away." The breaking point came during a family council meeting. Mrs. Lee had been attending these monthly gatherings, hoping to learn more about facility policies. As families discussed their concerns, a pattern emerged. Most incidents seemed to happen during the night shift, when fewer staff members were present and visitors were rare. After the meeting, a nurse's aide who was about to retire pulled Mrs. Lee aside. "I've worked here for 15 years, she said, hands trembling slightly. "Things changed after the new management took over. They cut staff, hired temps without proper background checks. Some of these new people, they're not here because they care about our seniors." Mrs. Lee spent hours researching similar cases online. She discovered stories of other families who had faced similar situations. Unexplained injuries, missing belongings, sudden behavioral changes in their loved ones. Many cases went uninvestigated due to lack of evidence. The residents, often too frightened or unable to speak up, suffered in silence. She tried bringing her concerns to the facility administrator, armed with pages of documented incidents. The response was always the same. "We take these concerns seriously, but without concrete evidence, there's nothing we can do. Perhaps your grandmother is just going through a phase." At home that evening, Mrs. Lee spread her notes across the kitchen table. She had dates, times, patterns of behavior, stories from other families, but nothing solid enough to force action. Her brother, who worked in security systems, noticed her frustration. "You know," he said, picking up one of her notebooks, "there are ways to gather evidence without relying on witness statements. Small cameras, completely hidden from view. We could place them strategically in grandmother's room." Mrs. Lee looked up sharply. "Is that even legal?" Her brother nodded slowly. "In most states, yes, as long as it's in a private room and only recording video, not audio. We'd need to check the specific regulations, but it might be our best chance to find out what's really happening during those night shifts." As she washed the dinner dishes that night, Mrs. Lee couldn't stop thinking about her grandmother's fearful eyes, the bruises, the trembling hands. Sometimes protecting the people you love meant taking risks. She picked up her phone and started researching hidden camera laws in their state. Whatever was happening at Golden Sunset Care Home, she was going to uncover the truth. The decision to install hidden cameras wasn't easy. Mrs. Lee spent 3 sleepless nights weighing the pros and cons, thinking about her grandmother's dignity and privacy. But each time she visited Golden Sunset and saw the fear lingering in her grandmother's eyes, she knew she had to act. Her brother brought over several tiny cameras one Sunday afternoon. They looked like ordinary wall hooks and smoke detectors, so normal you'd never give them a second glance. "These are motion activated," he explained, showing her how they worked on his laptop. They'll only record when there's movement in the room, and they have night vision capabilities. They carefully planned the installation. Mrs. Lee studied the daily schedule at Golden Sunset, noting when the rooms were cleaned, when medications were given, and when most staff changes occurred. They needed a time when the room would be empty long enough to set everything up properly. "What if we get caught?" Mrs. Lee asked, turning one of the cameras over in her hands. Her brother smiled gently. "We're not doing anything wrong. I've checked all the state laws. Families have the right to monitor their loved ones' private rooms as long as we're only recording video, not audio. We just need to be smart about placement." They decided to tell only one other person, their mother. At first, she was hesitant, worried about possible retaliation from the staff if they discovered the cameras. But after spending an afternoon with her own mother, watching how she flinched when doors slammed and how her hands shook during certain staff members' shifts, she agreed it was necessary. The following Tuesday, during the residents' afternoon activity hour, Mrs. Lee and her brother put their plan into action. While she kept watch near the door, chatting with passing staff members about the upcoming family council meeting, her brother quickly installed the cameras. One looked like a normal wall hook near the window. Another blended in with the room's smoke detector. The third, disguised as a small clock, sat on the bedside table. They worked quickly, hearts pounding with every footstep in the hallway. Each camera had to be perfectly positioned to capture the entire room while remaining completely inconspicuous. Mrs. Lee's hands trembled as she helped adjust the angles, thinking about what they might discover. "Remember," her brother said as he connected the last wire, "these cameras upload directly to a secure cloud server. Nobody can delete or tamper with the footage. You'll be able to check it from your phone anytime." That evening, after everything was in place, Mrs. Lee sat with her grandmother during dinner. She wanted badly to tell her about the cameras, to assure her the help was coming, but she knew they couldn't risk the wrong person overhearing. Instead, she just held her grandmother's hand a little tighter than usual. "You seem worried, dear," her grandmother said softly, patting her hand. "Don't worry so much about your old grandmother. Everything will be okay." Mrs. Lee fought back tears. Even now, her grandmother was trying to protect her, just as she had done throughout her childhood. "I know it will, Nay," she whispered. "I promise." Back home that night, Mrs. Lee stared at the new app on her phone. 3 little green dots showed that all cameras were working properly. Her brother had set up notifications to alert her of any unusual activity during the night shift. Now all they could do was wait and watch. She thought about all the other residents at Golden Sunset, the ones whose families had shared their stories, and the ones who might be suffering in silence. If they found evidence of wrongdoing, it wouldn't just help her grandmother. It could help everyone. Before going to bed, Mrs. Lee checked the cameras one last time. The night shift had just started, and her grandmother was safely in bed, the soft glow of her nightlight casting gentle shadows on the wall. Whatever happened next, at least now, they would know the truth. She just hoped they were prepared for what the cameras might reveal. The first week of monitoring the hidden cameras felt like watching paint dry. Mrs. Lee checked the footage obsessively, reviewing each alert that popped up on her phone. Most of what she saw was exactly what should happen in a care facility: nurses checking vitals, medication being given on schedule, and routine care being provided during the day shift. Her brother had set up the system to organize clips by time and date, making it easier to spot patterns. During the day, things seemed normal. The regular staff members were gentle with her grandmother, often chatting with her as they helped with daily tasks. Some even brought her extra pillows or stopped by just to say hello. "Maybe we were wrong," Mrs. Lee said to her brother during their weekly family dinner. "Maybe the falls really were just accidents." But even as she said it, she noticed how her hands still shook slightly when checking the footage. Then came the night shift. It started subtly at first. A medication given 2 hours late. A call button ignored for 45 minutes. Her grandmother's water pitcher left empty despite her requests for a refill. Small things that could be explained away as simple oversight, but together painted a picture of neglect. What troubled Mrs. Lee most was how different some staff members acted when they thought no one was watching. One particular aide, who always smiled sweetly when family members were around, would enter the room without knocking, roughly adjust her grandmother's position without speaking to her, and leave personal items just out of reach. The footage from Tuesday night made Mrs. Lee's blood run cold. Her grandmother had asked for help to use the bathroom, pressing her call button repeatedly. When the aide finally came, nearly an hour later, she yanked the blankets off and muttered something under her breath. The wheelchair was brought over, but its brakes weren't checked, something that was supposed to be standard protocol. Mrs. Lee watched in horror as her grandmother was transferred too quickly, almost falling. The aide caught her, but not before letting out an annoyed sigh and handling her like a sack of groceries rather than a human being. Her grandmother's face showed pain, but she didn't make a sound. She had learned to stay quiet. "Look at this," Mrs. Lee showed her brother the next morning, hands trembling as she pulled up the clip. "See how the wheelchair brake isn't being checked. And look at the time stamp. This is happening when they think nobody's paying attention." They began noticing other disturbing patterns. During certain night shifts, her grandmother's room would go unchecked for hours at a time, despite the facility's policy requiring checks every 2 hours. Sometimes they'd hear other residents calling for help in the hallway, their voices echoing unanswered. The worst moments weren't the obviously aggressive acts. Those would be easy to report. It was the subtle cruelty. Ignoring requests for pain medication, leaving food just out of reach, talking about residents as if they weren't there. The kind of abuse that was hard to prove but slowly crushed the spirit. One night, Mrs. Lee watched as her grandmother tried to reach her glasses on the bedside table. They had been deliberately placed too far away, and she struggled for several minutes before giving up, her hands falling limply to her sides. The defeat in her posture was heartbreaking. "We need to do something," Mrs. Lee told her brother, rewatching the clips for the dozenth time. "But we need more evidence. Something that shows this isn't just 1 or 2 incidents." They decided to wait just a little longer, documenting everything meticulously. Mrs. Lee created a detailed log, dates, times, staff members involved, and every violation of care standards they observed. Her brother backed up all the footage to multiple secure locations. They couldn't risk losing any evidence. Every morning, Mrs. Lee would visit her grandmother, trying to act normal while carrying the weight of what she'd seen the night before. She'd straighten the room, ensure everything was within easy reach, and press gentle kisses to her grandmother's forehead. Just a little longer, she'd whisper to herself, "We'll make this right." They knew the next shift could reveal the evidence they needed to stop this abuse once and for all. But waiting and watching while someone you love suffers, that was proving to be the hardest part of all. The truth finally came to light on a quiet Sunday night. Mrs. Lee had just finished dinner when her phone buzzed with an alert from the hidden cameras. At first, she almost didn't check it. She'd seen so many routine notifications over the past weeks. But something made her pick up the phone. The footage started normally enough. The night shift aide entered the room without knocking, as usual. Mrs. Lee's grandmother was sitting in her wheelchair by the window, where she often liked to look at the garden before bedtime. What happened next made Mrs. Lee's heart stop. The aide was clearly irritated, rushing through her tasks. Instead of properly helping her grandmother prepare for bed, she roughly pushed the wheelchair toward the bed. When her grandmother quietly asked for her evening medication, the aide snapped back, "You'll get it when I have time." But the worst was yet to come. As the aide transferred her grandmother to the bed, she deliberately left the wheelchair unlocked. When her grandmother reached for support, the chair rolled away, causing her to lose balance. Instead of helping, the aide stepped back and watched her struggle. Mrs. Lee's hands shook as she watched her grandmother try to catch herself, barely managing to grab the bed rail. The aide's response was chilling. See what happens when you're so demanding? Next time you'll wait patiently for your medicine. Without thinking, Mrs. Lee called her brother. You need to see this now, she said, her voice trembling. She sent him the clip while staying on the phone. I've seen enough, he said after a moment of heavy silence. This is deliberate. She's creating situations where falls are likely to happen, then reporting them as accidents. We have to report this immediately. Mrs. Lee was already grabbing her car keys. I'm going there right now. Wait, her brother cautioned. We need to do this right. If we rush in now, they might try to cover it up. Let me pull together all the footage from the past weeks. We'll take everything to the administration first thing in the morning. That night was the longest of Mrs. Lee's life. She kept watching the live feed from her grandmother's room, terrified of what might happen next. The aide returned twice more, each time being unnecessarily rough and leaving items just out of reach. By morning, Mrs. Lee and her brother had compiled everything. Weeks of video evidence showing a clear pattern of neglect and intentional endangerment. They had timestamps, dates, and multiple incidents clearly showing how the aide created dangerous situations. They also had proof of other serious issues. Medications given hours late or sometimes not at all. Call buttons unplugged. Water pitchers left empty despite requests. And personal items deliberately placed out of reach. The night shift aide's behavior wasn't just negligent. It was calculated to cause distress. The hardest part was telling their mother. She sat silent as they showed her some of the less upsetting clips, tears rolling down her cheeks. All this time, she whispered, Mom tried to tell us something was wrong, but she was too scared to say exactly what. Walking into Golden Sunset that morning felt different. Mrs. Lee carried a laptop containing all the evidence, her brother beside her with backup copies safely stored. They had also printed still images from the most telling incidents, along with a detailed timeline of events. We're here to see the administrator, Mrs. Lee told the receptionist, her voice steady despite her racing heart. It's about resident safety, and we're not leaving until we speak with someone in charge. The receptionist must have sensed their determination because within minutes, they were seated in the administrator's office. As they set up the laptop to show the footage, Mrs. Lee thought about her grandmother, probably having breakfast down the hall, unaware that finally, everything was about to change. She took a deep breath, looked the administrator in the eye, and said, We need to show you something, and after you see it, we need to talk about what you're going to do to protect not just my grandmother, but every resident in this facility. The truth was finally coming out, and there would be no more excuses, no more dismissing their concerns, no more accidents. The cameras had captured everything, and now it was time for action. The administrator's face changed as she watched the footage. Her professional smile faded, replaced by genuine shock and then anger. She paused the video several times, taking detailed notes, her hand shaking slightly as she wrote. I've been running care facilities for 20 years, she said finally, looking up from her notepad. This is completely unacceptable. She reached for her phone, immediately calling the facility's head of security and director of nursing to join them. Within an hour, the small office was filled with facility leadership. The room fell silent as Mrs. Lee's brother played clip after clip. Some staff members gasped at particularly troubling moments. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Why didn't anyone notice this before? The director of nursing asked, her voice tight with emotion. Mrs. Lee took out her notebook, filled with dates and observations. We tried to tell you. Multiple families tried to tell you. But without proof, our concerns were dismissed as confusion or overreaction. The head of security leaned forward. We need to contact the police, he said firmly. This isn't just negligence. This is intentional abuse of a vulnerable adult. It's criminal. What happened next moved at lightning speed. The facility called the local police department's elder abuse unit. Mrs. Lee and her brother spent hours with 2 detectives, showing them the footage and explaining the timeline of events. The detectives took everything seriously, asking detailed questions and making copies of all their evidence. The hardest moment came when they had to explain everything to Mrs. Lee's grandmother. Her hands trembled as she listened, but there was also relief in her eyes, relief at finally being believed, at knowing she wasn't imagining things. "I was so afraid," she whispered, holding her daughter's hand. "I thought if I complained too much, they might treat me even worse. Or they might do something to the other residents who couldn't speak up for themselves." The facility's response was swift. The night shift aide was immediately suspended pending investigation. Security was increased, especially during night shifts. The administrator ordered a complete review of all resident care procedures and staff background checks. But it didn't stop there. Other families started coming forward with their own stories. The detectives discovered that the aide had worked at 3 other facilities under different names, leaving each one just before suspicions could be confirmed. Mrs. Lee found herself sitting with these families in the facility's common room, listening to their experiences. An elderly man's son talked about missing medications. A woman described how her mother had become withdrawn and frightened. Each story added another piece to the puzzle. The local elder care ombudsman got involved, launching a broader investigation into night shift staffing at all area nursing homes. Mrs. Lee's brother was asked to give presentations about the importance of proper security measures and family vigilance. One morning, about a week after they'd shown the footage, Mrs. Lee arrived to find her grandmother sitting by the window, actually smiling. A new aide had helped her arrange her favorite plants on the windowsill, making sure everything was within easy reach. "You know what the best part is?" her grandmother said, patting the chair beside her. "It's not just about me. What you did will help protect everyone here. That's what matters most." The facility organized a resident and family council meeting to address everyone's concerns. The room was packed. More people attended than ever before. The administrator stood up and publicly acknowledged their failures in oversight, then outlined specific changes being implemented. New security cameras were being installed in all common areas. Staff schedules were revised to ensure better supervision during night shifts. Background checks were being enhanced, and a new system was put in place for residents and families to report concerns anonymously. Mrs. Lee sat in that meeting, holding her grandmother's hand, thinking about how one small decision, to trust her instincts and take action, had sparked such significant changes. Her grandmother squeezed her hand gently, as if reading her thoughts. Sometimes she realized the biggest changes start with one person refusing to look away from something wrong. The cameras had revealed the truth, but it was the human connection, the determination to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, that would create lasting change. What started as one family's fight for justice quickly grew into something much bigger. As news of the hidden camera footage spread, the police investigation expanded beyond Golden Sunset Care Home. Detective Thompson, a veteran of the Elder Abuse Unit, uncovered a troubling pattern spanning several facilities in the region. "Your case broke open a dam," he told Mrs. Lee during a follow-up meeting. "We've received dozens of similar reports from other nursing homes. Families who were afraid to speak up before are now coming forward." The detective spread several files across his desk. The night shift aide, who had tormented Mrs. Lee's grandmother, had worked at 5 different facilities in 3 counties, always using slightly different names on her applications. At each location, residents had reported problems, but she would disappear before any formal investigation could begin. "How did she keep getting hired?" Mrs. Lee asked, looking at the trail of paperwork. "She exploited gaps in the system," the detective explained. Different facilities used different background check systems. She'd worked through temporary agencies, switching between them frequently. When questions arose, she'd simply move to another facility before anyone could connect the dots. But now, those dots were being connected. 2 more families had installed cameras in their loved ones' rooms, capturing similar incidents of neglect and intentional endangerment. Their footage matched the pattern Mrs. Lee had documented: medication delays, call buttons left unplugged, personal items placed out of reach. The local news picked up the story, being careful not to show any actual footage out of respect for the residents' privacy. Instead, they focused on the systemic issues: inadequate background checks, insufficient night staff supervision, and the challenges families faced in protecting their loved ones. Back at Golden Sunset, the changes were dramatic. The facility hired a new night supervisor who made regular rounds with a tablet, documenting each check-in with photos. Care plans were reviewed and updated. Staff members received additional training on proper resident care and ethics. Other facilities in the area started making changes too, not waiting for problems to surface. One nursing home installed a new camera system in all common areas. Another implemented a family feedback app where concerns could be reported and tracked in real time. Mrs. Lee's grandmother noticed the difference. "The new aide actually talks to me while helping me get ready for bed," she told her granddaughter one evening. "She asks what I need, makes sure I'm comfortable. It's how it always should have been." The investigation also revealed stories of good caregivers who had tried to report problems but weren't heard. A young nurse's aide came forward, tears in her eyes, describing how she'd attempted to report suspicious bruises but was told not to make waves. "Those of us who really care about our residents felt helpless," she explained during a staff meeting. "Now we feel like we can actually do our jobs properly." Support groups started forming in the community. Families shared resources, advice, and experiences. Mrs. Lee found herself speaking at these meetings, helping other families recognize warning signs and understand their rights. Her brother's expertise proved invaluable. He developed a simple guide for families considering camera installation, explaining legal requirements and resident privacy rights. Care facilities across the state began requesting copies. The district attorney's office took special interest in the case. They assigned a prosecutor who specialized in elder abuse, recognizing that this case could help establish stronger precedents for future prosecutions. "Your grandmother's case is important," the prosecutor explained during a meeting. "It shows how technology can help protect vulnerable residents when used properly. But more than that, it shows why we need better oversight and stricter background check requirements." One afternoon, Mrs. Lee arrived at Golden Sunset to find several residents gathered in the common room, sharing stories with a state health department investigator. They spoke freely now, no longer afraid of retaliation. Their voices, once silenced by fear, were finally being heard. Mrs. Lee watched as her grandmother joined the group, offering gentle encouragement to a newer resident who was nervous about speaking up. Seeing her grandmother's strength, her willingness to help others even after everything she'd been through, made Mrs. Lee realize that sometimes the worst situations can bring out the best in people. The ripples from their small act of installing cameras were spreading, touching lives they'd never even met. What began as one family's search for truth was becoming a movement for change in elder care across the entire state. The day of the court hearing arrived with a mix of anxiety and hope. Mrs. Lee sat in the courtroom with her family, watching as other families filled the benches. Some she recognized from Golden Sunset, others had come from different nursing homes, all united by similar experiences. The prosecutor presented the evidence methodically, starting with the hidden camera footage. Though it was difficult to watch, each clip told an important part of the story. The judge leaned forward, paying close attention to every detail, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood the seriousness of the situation. Mrs. Lee's grandmother had insisted on testifying, despite her family's concerns about it being too stressful. When she took the stand, her voice was quiet but clear. "I'm not here just for myself," she said, looking directly at the judge. "I'm here for everyone who was too scared to speak up, who still might be too scared." The defense tried to dismiss the incidents as isolated events, claiming overwork and understaffing were to blame. But the evidence was overwhelming. The pattern of deliberate neglect and intentional endangerment couldn't be explained away as simple mistakes or oversight. During a break in the proceedings, Mrs. Lee found herself speaking with other families in the courthouse hallway. An elderly man gripped her hand, tears in his eyes. "Because of you and your grandmother," he said, "my wife finally told me what was happening to her. We got her moved to a better facility. You gave us the courage to act." The state's Elder Care Oversight Board sent representatives to observe the trial. They took extensive notes, particularly when discussion turned to how the aide had managed to work at multiple facilities despite previous complaints. It was clear that changes to the system were already in motion. When the verdict came, it was decisive. The aide was found guilty on multiple counts of elder abuse and neglect. But the judge went further, addressing the broader issues the case had exposed. He ordered a complete review of hiring practices in all state-licensed care facilities and mandated improved background check systems. This case, the judge stated, has revealed not just individual wrongdoing, but system-wide failures that put our most vulnerable citizens at risk. That stops now. The local paper covered the verdict, but what caught Mrs. Lee's attention wasn't the headlines about justice being served. It was the smaller stories that followed. About other facilities voluntarily installing security cameras, about new training programs for staff, about families feeling empowered to advocate for their loved ones. Back at Golden Sunset, the changes were lasting. The new administrator had implemented a resident dignity program, where care was reviewed regularly by a committee that included family members. Staff morale improved as good caregivers felt supported in providing proper care. Mrs. Lee's grandmother's room became something of an unofficial gathering spot for residents. They'd come to chat, share concerns, or just enjoy her company. She had emerged from her ordeal stronger, becoming someone others looked to for support and guidance. "You know what makes me happiest?" she told Mrs. Lee one afternoon as they watched birds at her window feeder. "Seeing new residents arrive and getting proper care from the start. No one should have to go through what we did to be treated with dignity." The state legislature took notice of the case. A committee began drafting new regulations for elder care facilities, consulting with families, care providers, and advocacy groups. Mrs. Lee was invited to testify about her family's experience and the importance of allowing families to monitor their loved ones' care. During one of these sessions, a legislator asked Mrs. Lee what motivated her to install the cameras. Her answer was simple: love. When you see someone you love suffering and scared, you'll move mountains to protect them. We just didn't realize our mountain would help create change for so many others. The aide's conviction sent a clear message throughout the elder care community: abuse and neglect wouldn't be tolerated. But more importantly, it showed that one family's courage to seek the truth could spark meaningful change for countless others. As Mrs. Lee left the courthouse that day, she remembered her grandmother's words from months ago: "Everything will be okay." Through determination, love, and an unwavering pursuit of justice, they had made that promise come true, not just for their family, but for many others as well. 1 year later, Mrs. Lee stood at a podium in the state capitol, preparing to witness the signing of what had become known as the Dignity in Care Act. The room was filled with families, care providers, and lawmakers who had worked together to create this comprehensive elder care reform bill. Looking out at the crowd, she spotted her grandmother sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. At 79, she had become an unexpected advocate for elder rights, sharing her story with anyone who needed to hear it. Her quiet strength had inspired countless others to speak up about their experiences. This law, the governor announced, ensures that no other family will have to resort to hidden cameras to protect their loved ones. The new legislation required round-the-clock supervision of care facilities, mandatory reporting systems for all incidents, and a unified background check database that would prevent problem caregivers from moving between facilities undetected. But the changes went far beyond just new rules and regulations. Golden Sunset had transformed into a model facility, hosting workshops for other nursing homes about implementing resident-centered care practices. Their new programs focused on treating residents with dignity and respect, ensuring that every staff member understood the importance of compassionate care. Mrs. Lee's brother had developed a free workshop for families about recognizing signs of elder abuse and understanding their rights. Knowledge is power, he would tell participants. When we know better, we do better. His simple guide about proper care standards had been translated into multiple languages and distributed to nursing homes across the country. The most touching changes were the small ones. In Golden Sunset's garden, residents now gathered for weekly tea parties, something that would have been unthinkable during the dark days of neglect. Mrs. Lee's grandmother helped organize these gatherings, making sure new residents felt welcome and heard. "Remember how scared I used to be?" her grandmother said one afternoon as they watched residents enjoying the garden. "Now I look forward to each day. That's what good care does. It gives people back their joy in living." The state's Elder Care Oversight Board had undergone a complete overhaul. They implemented surprise inspections, especially during night shifts, and created an anonymous reporting system that actually worked. Care facilities were required to have resident and family councils with real power to influence policies. One day, while visiting her grandmother, Mrs. Lee met a new resident's daughter who was touring the facility. The woman was understandably nervous, asking detailed questions about care standards and supervision. "Let me show you something," Mrs. Lee's grandmother said, leading them to the activity room. There, posted prominently on the wall, was a resident rights charter, emergency contact numbers, and clear procedures for reporting concerns. "This is what good care looks like," she explained. "We had to fight for it, but now it's here for everyone." The former detective who had handled their case now led specialized training sessions for law enforcement about investigating elder abuse. He often used their case as an example of how one family's actions could uncover systemic problems and lead to meaningful solutions. Mrs. Lee had kept in touch with many of the families she'd met during the investigation and trial. They formed a support network, helping other families navigate the care system and advocate for their loved ones. Their shared experiences had created lasting bonds of friendship and understanding. The most profound change was in the culture of elder care itself. Facilities across the state had shifted from viewing family involvement as an inconvenience to seeing it as essential for quality care. Staff members who truly cared about residents felt empowered to report problems without fear of retaliation. "You know what makes me proudest?" her grandmother asked during the bill signing reception. "It's not just that we fixed what was wrong. It's that we helped create something better. Now when families bring their loved ones here, they can trust they'll be cared for with dignity." As Mrs. Lee hugged her grandmother that day, she thought about how their difficult journey had led to this moment. One small decision to trust her instincts and take action had sparked a movement that would protect countless vulnerable seniors. The hidden cameras had revealed the truth, but it was the human response, the dedication to turning that truth into positive change, that had created lasting impact. Their story had become more than just an expose of wrongdoing. It was a testament to the power of love, courage, and the unwavering belief that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect.